everybody. My name is Jenny Herget, and I'm the TA coordinator with the National Alliance for Safe Housing. I will be helping with the background of the presentation today. So you're in a presentation called Supporting Safe Housing Stability for Survivors Through Flexible Funding. And your presenters are going to be Suzanne Marcus, who's also with NASH, Ho Win, who's with the Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women, and Linda Olson with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. We are going to be presenting for about an hour this morning or afternoon, depending on where you're at. And then we'll have half an hour for questions and answers at the end. Throughout the presentation, if you have questions that come up that you'd like to discuss during the Q&A, feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll make sure to get to those at the end of the presentation. After today's presentation, we'll also be sending out a short evaluation as well as some resources that the presenters mention. And you should see that in your email probably early on Monday. And with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to our presenters.
Great. Thank you, Jenny. This is Suzanne Marcus with the National Alliance for Safe Housing. Happy Friday, everybody. I'm excited to be presenting with my colleagues Ho and Linda about flexible funding and the various ways that we use it in our own communities and how it's been evaluated and researched and proven to be a really effective practice for helping survivors avoid homelessness or maintain housing. So without further ado, I will jump in and first start by telling you a little bit about the National Alliance for Safe Housing. We are a subsidiary of the District Alliance for Safe Housing, which is a local safe housing program in Washington, D.C. And we have a national technical assistance and training, well, we are, NASH, the National Alliance for Safe Housing, is the technical assistance and training provider. And we launched our work in 2015. And we partner with Linda and the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, as well as the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And we're part of the Federal Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium, and we collaborate with some national technical assistance providers, and NEDV and our CDV, as well as Collaborative Solutions, Inc. They're a HUD provider. We all have deep expertise on housing, or at the intersection of housing and homelessness. And at the end of the presentation, we'll share a little bit more about a resource that we've been working on collaboratively that calls Best Practices in Research at this intersection. And you can find a lot of great information on flexible funding there, which I will share with you towards the end of the presentation. NASH, our mission is to provide programs and communities with the tools and strategies and support necessary to improve coordination between domestic and sexual violence services and homeless and housing providers, so that survivors and their children can ultimately avoid homelessness as the only means of living free from abuse. Today, we're hoping through our presentation, we'll answer a lot of commonly asked questions about flexible funding, which are, what are the connections between domestic violence, sexual violence, and homelessness? What is flexible funding, and how can it help address that sort of confluence of domestic violence and homelessness and sexual violence? And what are the core components typically used by programs serving survivors through flexible funding? And what are some of the common challenges and barriers that flexible funding programs encounter? Because there are a few. And how can flexible funding programs be financed? And we're excited to share with you some creative ways, and both through charitable foundations and federal funds that can be used to help finance these programs, and then share with you evidence documenting the impact of flexible funding on survivors' ability to access housing and avoid homelessness. I'm going to start with just sharing some information, some foundational information for those who, and I know we have a lot of fabulous advocates on the call, so this information might not be entirely new to you, but I wanted to start by talking about what the connection is between domestic violence, sexual violence, and homelessness. So escaping domestic violence may mean losing housing and income, or an inability to sustain housing if an abuser leaves, which I know many of you are well aware of, and that many survivors stay in abusive situations in order to remain housed, especially when there are children involved. And a study of homeless women with children found that 80% had previously experienced domestic violence, and studies also show that as many as 57% of all homeless women report domestic violence as an immediate cause of their homelessness. And that really just scratches the surface of what we know in terms of how many survivors are in the homeless housing system. We also know that there's an overrepresentation of people of color in the homeless system. And there is a study, and we'll post the link for folks who are unaware of the Center for Social Innovation, SPARK project, which examined over 111,000 HMIS records and collected 148 oral histories and conducted 18 focus groups in 6 U.S. cities. And through this research, they found that more than 78% of people experiencing homelessness were people of color. So just to give you some context, the general population of the United States is 74% white, 12% black, and 17% Hispanic Latinx. Black people comprise 13% of the general population in the United States, and 26% of those are living in poverty, and yet account for more than 40% of the homeless population. Poverty rates alone don't explain the overrepresentation. Homelessness among American Indian, Alaska Native people are 3 to 8 times higher than their representation in the general population. And DV was identified as a common thread in the lives of many respondents in the SPARK study. A newly published study in Canada has found that Housing First enhanced with anti-racism practices can improve housing. And what we think flexible funding is particularly promising in helping to address people's needs, particularly people living on the margins and people of color, as it connects to something that SPARK found through their work. So through their research, they identified something common amongst folks, which was that there was a lack of financial capital and a lack of emotional support. And they called this phenomenon, network impoverishment. It's not just that the individual or family is experiencing poverty, but the network, the social support network itself functions in an impoverished state. So domestic violence or intimate partner violence was identified as that common thread in people's lives of many of the respondents, as I mentioned. And the promise of flexible funding is that for those who are living at the edge of homelessness and can't rely on a safety net, that we have found that flexible funding can provide some immediate crisis assistance so that an immediate event or an immediate crisis event doesn't turn into something cascading and long-lasting and completely tips somebody into homelessness. So what is flexible funding exactly? Well, we call it, I'm sorry, Ho, I just got on a roll.
It's okay.
Got excited. I'm going to pass over this section to my colleague Ho, who will talk a little bit about what exactly is flexible funding.
Oh, thanks, Suzanne. That was you're doing a great job. Hey, everybody. My name is Ho, and I am with the Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women, and I am the program manager of our Housing Economic Justice Program. So I'll talk a little bit more about the specific work that we're doing in Minnesota a little bit later in the presentation, but right now I'm just going to talk a little bit about some general understanding of what flex funding is and how this group of presenters is defining it. So as you can see on your screen, so just briefly, so we describe it as cash grants and advocacy used to address whatever barriers exist between domestic violence and sexual violence survivors. safe housing stability. So you can really kind of distill it down to it's cash plus advocacy. And it's similar to how a lot of programs will create a direct client assistance fund that a lot of programs are used, but what makes this difference is it's flexible, as in sort of the survivor is the one that drives this versus the program driving it. And so there's sort of less proof that's needed, and less regs, and it's more about the trust of the relationship between the advocate and the survivor. And the main focus being on safe housing stability, which is in itself a broad term, but we also know that there are a lot of things that survivors go through that will sort of cycle back to housing, and we know that housing is a big foundation for safety and stability. Okay, so why, right? The question is, why is there flex funding if there's already something like direct client assistance fund? So we know that sometimes it is just a matter of a few $100s that makes the difference between a person or a family that's experiencing homelessness. So an example may be the family is short $200 on rent, and this is sort of like their last chance, right? And so with a flexible spending, with some advocacy and kind of working together, if they can figure out that $200 is going to make the difference, then we can keep that family housed versus that family then losing their housing and then cycling through the homeless system and then potentially cycling through more violence. So there are a lot of studies that do say flex funding for those who have an immediate need for the money, there are also long-term positive impacts. And so we're going to go through that a little bit more in the presentation and talk about some of the evaluation that each of the program has done on their respective funding and what that looks like. And here just are some examples of the types of flex spending grants that have been used. So this particular example, I believe, is from DASH, which Suzanne had mentioned earlier on, is the District Alliance for Safe Housing, which is the shelter or the domestic violence program out in DC. So some of the ways that money can be used is for moving expenses, car repairs, utilities, back rent, medical bills. So as you see in this nice little graphic, it's broad. It's broad because we know that these are often the things that people can't get funding for, and these are the things that sort of create a cycle of fines and fees and the inability to, to pay for things in order to just sort of make ends meet. So, Suzanne, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the specific stuff out in DASH, or if you want me to cover that.
It's up to you. I'm happy to share just that, and I know that we've found that, it's while we're looking at flexible funding as a way to help survivors maintain housing stability, to define that broadly, that it doesn't mean always rent, back rent, or connected to what you might imagine is sort of the obvious payments for what one would need immediate housing stability, but that we have found that everything from, car repair, child care, and even as unusual as tattoo removal, it can all connect to housing stability. As you can see, it's connected to one's ability to get to work or one's ability to hold down a job. So what's made our program really useful is that we're able to define it broadly. And then, Hel, I know that you have some great examples about that too. But I just wanted to flag that for the diversity of ways that we use the funds. It's not just about rent and back rent, but we're able to really think broadly about how to support survivors with their flex funding.
Mm-hmm. And then as we move forward, I'll give some specific grant averages that my program had used. But just for example, some folks may be wondering, so how much are you actually giving? So for DASH, some of the average grant was around $2,000. and they range anywhere from like $200-something all the way to like $8,500. So as Suzanne said, it really depends on what the particular need is of that family. So one example we had in my program, we had somebody use the money to buy a security system, and that was really kind of enough to help them with their housing stability. So again, as Suzanne said, it's not always necessarily directly related to rent or security deposit or application fee, but it's all the things that surround a person's whole life in which they may need some funding assistance in order for them to be able to focus on either, making that rent payment. It's either, that car repair or that rent payment. And if we're able to help with something like a car repair, then they can actually put that money towards, they can put their other money towards rent payment. So that's kind of a little, in a nutshell, what this was, what flex spending is. And the other, move too fast. So the other piece is, so it's really about how to support a survivor in their housing stability. And it's really also about thinking about housing stability in a much broader way than oftentimes a lot of people in the community think and talk about it. So you can also think about it as a bridge from like shelter to permanent housing, right? It's a way to facilitate that process for some folks. It's also a strategy to prevent homelessness. As we had said, sometimes it's $200-300 that makes or breaks the difference. And it's also just one of several tools that we know that advocates can use, right? So we're not necessarily saying this is the end-all, be-all, but it is a tool that can be used that is really about flexibility, that's about centering the survivor, that's really having them drive it, that can really sort of help support everybody.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Ho. And I want to, this transitions really nicely what you said about how what's core to flex funding is that it's about the flexibility, and it's about it being survivor-centered, and that the survivor defines his or her needs and the ability to have those funds be flexible, and and you're able to sort of do that in a holistic way. And so I want to talk a little bit about the core components of a flexible funding program, because in order for it to be effective, it's important, we have found in our work, that the program be low barrier, and that it be survivor-driven, that it be flexible, truly flexible, and that the funds are able to be disseminated quickly, because these are funds that we often are using in a crisis, and the need needs to be addressed quickly before housing becomes, before it becomes a crisis. And that housing becomes lost. So I first want to talk about low barrier access to funds. So what does that mean? So advocates determine when flexible funding can assist with stabilizing safe housing, and that assessment process to determine what a survivor needs is driven by the relationship with the survivor rather than a form or check off the boxes. So in programs where flex funding is truly low barrier, we're really looking and empowering the advocate to make those decisions based on a relationship that the advocate has developed with the survivor to make those determinations, and that there's typically no cap on the amount of money a survivor can request or a limit of time the survivor can request support. Again, these decisions can be made soundly with the right kind of empowerment and support of the advocate to develop those relationships with the survivor so that together they can make good decisions. Of course, as we discussed, another really important program component to flexible funding is truly the flexibility of those funds and how you can use them. In an immediate crisis, as I mentioned, it can have a cascading impact on someone without a financial or social safety net. So really being able to address those barriers that can exist between a survivor and housing stability can be direct, as Ho had mentioned, such as paying rent, or indirect, such as helping to pay for travel, childcare, car repair. And again, of course, we know that this can be connected to your funding stream, and so often you're limited. So what we'll be talking about a little bit later is just the diversity of ways you can fund the program and how helpful it is when you can, as Linda beautifully says, braid together different funding streams so that you can have the flexibility to address the needs, whether they be direct or indirect. And survivor-driven advocacy. So what does that mean in terms of flexible funding? That advocates utilize this relationship that they are establishing with the survivor using a trauma-informed support. So with the survivor, the advocate can determine the kind of advocacy and funding needed to support ongoing stability and offer safety planning before, during, and after the flexible funding grant is provided. So it's really important to think about flexible funding as just a component of the support you're offering survivors. It's flexible funding always coupled with safety planning, always coupled with housing advocacy. As the survivor, of course, as it relates to what the survivor is stating that he or she wants, but it's never just, a check written out and that's it, but truly an opportunity for advocacy and support in addition to the funding. For example, just a quick example of the ways we've done it at DASH is often the flexible funding is coupled with, of course, safety planning and often advocacy that with the survivor's consent that our advocates will do with their landlord or with the utility company. And what has been a great outcome with that kind of advocacy is often our advocates are able to get late payments lowered or completely erased and better negotiate a payment plan. So depending on the kind of advocacy that's needed, often we're able to negotiate a better payment and ultimately spend less money to support the survivor's stability. And lastly, the kind of advocacy that we do coupled with the financial assistance is to leverage other supports. So whether that's what the survivor is able to do with her own advocacy, with perhaps her faith-based community or other communities or other supports, and then we're able to leverage that with the funds that we're able to put forth. I do want to stress, though, that that's not a requirement, but it's always nice when that's something that can be done, but want to caution against requiring that survivors bring money to the table, in order to provide support, because often that's why the survivor's there. They don't have any resources, but it's always a nice option when advocates are able to leverage other resources to maximize the impact of a grant. And then lastly, the swift dissemination of funds. So of course, flexible funds are most helpful when they can be provided quickly, especially when it's a crisis threatening housing stability. So by quickly, we try to aim for 24 to 48 hours. And, I know that this is often a challenge. It's frankly a challenge. It's been a challenge for our organization, too, to figure out how to do that. Some examples of how programs can manage it is to minimize the layers of organizational bureaucracy and approval processes to get the checks cut, and to place advocates in charge of a budget and give them the discretion to make these decisions, and then to utilize private funding that requires minimal restrictions and parameters that offer greater flexibility with the grants and often perhaps less documentation. So these are just some things. We can talk about challenges, and I know Linda will go into it, but ideally, if there's a way that you can work with the organization you're with to minimize those barriers, that you can turn those funds around quickly, we found that's a critical component to its effectiveness. the effectiveness of flex funding. So now I'm going to turn it over to Linda, who's going to talk about some of the common challenges that flex funding programs encounter.
All right. Thanks so much, Suzanne. And I'm Linda Olson with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and we are now entering our 10th year of doing DV Housing First with flexible financial assistance, of course, just a key component of that particular strategy. And I was happy to get this particular segment because I feel like I've heard almost every possible challenge you can imagine. I don't dare say that. I know that there will be more down the road, but I've just finished a couple of rounds now of focus groups with advocates as well as with survivors, and have been hearing just, again, how challenging. You know, it sounds beautiful. We know it is. It's great being able to have money to give out, and it's really hard work. And I just want to express my admiration for advocates who do the whole variety of work that you do, and then also step into this place of discernment along with a survivor about money, about dispersing flexible financial assistance in a supportive and empowering way. And it's so common, especially when you don't have a lot of money, to start budgeting or being really careful about, is this person really a DV survivor? Is this person really that needy? And we step into this gatekeeper role in the hope of being a good steward of the money, whether it's a donation or a foundation or public funding, certainly. I think just putting that into context, what I hear in our urban and our rural programs is too frequently when word gets out on the street, whether it's in a rural program and everybody knows everybody and what they're getting from any place that they're going, or if it's a larger urban program and perhaps referrals are coming to a DV agency for money, is how to deal with people who lead in saying, I hear you've got money, I want that. And I think the reality is to take that deep breath and really think through the neediness of this person, the fact that in a trauma-informed lens, you know that desperate people who are in survival mode, and certainly homelessness with the domestic violence and sexual violence also playing a part, can maybe lead people to that desperate place where the advocate is just feeling a little cornered and compromised. So I want to be realistic about that and about what it takes to put on your trauma-informed lens and to really go into a conversation speaking to the safety planning that you've already heard is vital, getting a sense of what the crisis is, having one of those trust-building conversations where you get to know the individual and you can assure that individual that you care about them and really want to hear what their concerns are. And be able to explore from that point what it is they need. What kind of a flexible financial assistance investment could help them immediately? What are the sorts of things that might be available to help them longer term? And see what their choices are and see what makes sense in terms of dispersing that money and doing it in a really thoughtful, sensitive sort of way. I think it's also important from the organizational level, realizing again the demands on advocates and the pressure of this discernment, even though there's a lot of joy associated with it, for the organization to take time to do those consults, to support advocates as they do this really critical work. So that's probably what came out of my most recent round of focus groups and have heard a lot over the 10 years with this particular initiative. As Suzanne has already mentioned, minimizing internal bureaucracy. It's so frustrating when you're in a larger organization and there isn't a smoother path in order to get funding dispersed. Some large organizations I know have set aside a special fund and have been able to do that in a way that an advocate can make a quick decision. Hopefully there isn't a whole process internally of a number of people having to approve, because that can slow it down. So it's a matter of trust in that advocate, as well as just the sense that people will make mistakes, or maybe it wasn't the best decision, and it's not the end of the universe. We will all continue on, and we will all learn from that. So again, trust is critical all the way through the process. And of course, conveying to potential funders how critical all of these core components are. And I just remember particularly early days on trying to sell funders who weren't necessarily private foundations of just the flexibility. And one of the criticisms was, well, we can't understand why this would be important to use for kids' needs. Like, why would we want to spend money for school pictures or athletic things or things that actually would help normalize a child's existence? And that is just so important for that survivor, so that they know that their kids are happy and they can move on with their life. We also know that there are times somebody would be so desperate to use money that might otherwise be used as rent in order to do something for their children, so that their child can fit in with what the needs are and what is happening in the community. So some of the stickier issues to consider, it just comes up again with the accountability of the money, beyond just that gatekeeper, heartfelt, how do we disperse this in a thoughtful way, but just making sure that there's conversation with a CPA when you think about your own internal auditing, depending on the source of the money. If you're looking at a public source, we were fortunate enough to convince the City of Seattle and King County that flexible financial assistance would be a great investment for them. But of course came the layers of concern about fraud and how do you document that. So it's really important to think that through, get appropriate consultation. There are wonderful hints in the fact sheet that's coming out. Should be attached soon to this particular presentation. Our webpage, as well as Suzanne's NASH webpage, the Alliance for Safe Housing, they all have some great hints on how to think through the legalities and if there are limits on the amount of money that can be given. So I would encourage you to check that out. It is perfectly fine to give survivors cash, and that can come under disaster relief or gifting. Again, it has to be well documented. I know that there are some requirements related to what is called miscellaneous income, especially with public funders, and that 1099 requirement for miscellaneous income. It is just a procedure. It isn't something that needs to limit money, though because there is a $600 kind of suggested limit for miscellaneous income on a 1099, agencies will turn at times to say we can't give any more than $600. You don't have to be that rigid, but again, check in with that CPA. And then finally, there is the issue of I-9s when you are paying a vendor, especially that landlord, and in the whole world of flexibility related to landlords. There are some that are doing whatever they're doing, and I won't say illegally, but maybe under the table. Maybe they are just that landlord that we desperately need. So when we do a vendor payment, we should have the landlord fill out an I-9. But again, see what you can do to negotiate and look at what your audit requirements are so that things can work for a really kind landlord who is trying to make things work for everybody. Limitations in terms of funding sources. It's always great to advocate and to do funder education and realize that people really care about abuse of the money and that you as advocates and working in an advocacy agency are probably the best storytellers in terms of what a great opportunity to make a difference in homelessness and domestic and sexual violence prevention. So,
hey, Linda, can I jump in and add in one thing with the 1099?
Sure.
So I just want to also say that when we were doing this at our coalition, when we checked in with our accountant around the 1099 for income, we were told, just so other folks know that this was just another thing to consider, that we were told from our accounting folks that the money was distributed, the money that we were distributing was being considered charitable giving, and so it didn't necessarily trigger a 1099 because it wasn't considered income. So again, I know, Linda, that you had said that it varies, and people should chat with their accountant or whoever is working on their organizational finances, but also just know that that was the message that we had got from our financial/accounting team when we had implemented this.
Oh, this is Suzanne. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and we would hope that everybody would get that, but my particular example comes from a public funder, the City of Seattle. So it was put out there as a potential requirement and became, instead of just something that people needed to be mindful of, and you're absolutely right, that it shouldn't be a problem. It absolutely shouldn't. But again, when you're negotiating, try not to fall into a funder's rigidity at times in terms of what they want to see, because it's not a cap and you don't need to worry about it. I'm sorry, Suzanne, go ahead. What were you
No, I just wanted to highlight something you had already mentioned, Linda, that the Washington State Coalition has a fabulous toolkit, and we will be posting a link to that, and also an FAQ on flexible funding that has just been released, and actually this group will be the first group to see it. And there too are links to very specific language, straight IRS code that you can look at that explains exactly the what you're discussing, Linda and Ho, about what is defined as a charitable gift, what is defined as, what you can define as as disaster relief. So that WSCDIV has been extremely helpful in pulling that information together for advocates, and it's available to you. So we will be sending that out.
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. And maybe just one more note there is in some states, and Washington, unfortunately, is one of them, it can impact TANF depending upon the timing of that flexible financial assistance gift. So by all means, check with your state and your local codes. Our Washington administrative codes are currently written in a way, though I think since we've pointed this issue out to our folks at DSHS that this is a problem, they'd like to change that and plan to, but it can really be a sensitive timing dance in terms of when somebody is potentially applying or reapplying for TANF. So, just go into it being aware of the pitfalls so that you don't get thrown and that you are just really solid in knowing that what you are doing is good, wonderful, and legal. And just put together your package of arguments when people are contributing to flexible financial assistance. So the next section is a little bit of a tag team with all of us that I'm just starting out, because we've all experienced in our different programs the variety of places that we go or have been gifted to us in order to provide money for survivors. And please, Suzanne and Ho, go ahead and just jump in. We have experienced just the beauty of charitable foundation funding. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for the past 10 years now has invested in flexible financial assistance for member agencies participating in DV Housing First, and it has been an amazing gift. We've also had that public-private partnership with a private foundation as well as with King County. And I know that fundraising appeals in the community have been very, very effective in actually bringing in different grants or donations. And do you have anything to add in terms of those bullets or the last two?
Yeah. Well, I can just talk a little bit about how DASH started our Survivor Resilience Fund. And this might be a great way to begin a flex funding program in your community, as we did a public-private funding partnership with our Washington, D.C. Office of Victim Services, and then a very generous private foundation. And then we engaged researchers from the MSU, Michigan State University, Dr. Chris Sullivan, and we'll share with you what we learned from that. But what we called it, and it was a pilot project, and we worked together, so it wasn't just donating or putting money behind this flex funding endeavor, but we worked extremely collaboratively with the private funder, our public funder, and our research team. And really it was so affirming for these partners to work together. We sat down on a quarterly basis and we looked at the impact of the funding. It was a wonderful way to build investment on all sides and to look together at the impact. It was a really wonderful experience, and I think it really helped prove and show firsthand to our funders, particularly to our city funder, just how impactful this kind of intervention was. So I think that was a really creative way we learned to do that and to really build a connection between the funders and the work that we were doing. And we also learned that way too, what the limits were to public funding. And we learned it, while we were doing it. So it was, we would hit roadblocks, and then together as a team would come up with new solutions. So what we ultimately ended up doing was, using the public funds to support our staff, our advocate staff, and some of the infrastructure. And then the private funding we put solely towards our SRF grants, or our flex funding grants. So that's an example of one way you could use the public-private partnership. Ho, did you have anything you'd want to share on your experiences financing your flex funding program?
Yeah, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it in the end, and I just want to be cognizant of time, so I'll just briefly say that. So in Minnesota, our funding pool is a lot smaller, and like I said, I'll share those particular numbers when I get to my portion at the end, but we were able to, for some of you, I don't know if you've heard or know of, but so Allstate Foundation partnered with NNEDB to create this Purple Purse, curriculum work, and it comes with some funding. So we were able to tap into that and to create well, we call it a survivor fund, but we really sort of mirrored it off of lessons learned from both DASH and Washington State to create that. And then in addition to that, after doing that for a few years and people getting really excited about this, we've actually also had a lot of individual donors. So again, the amounts that we raise and that we have are much smaller than Washington or DASH, but we're able to sort of still utilize the same principles and still give small amounts.
Great. Does anybody want to speak a little bit on the survivor-led funding strategies? I think that's such a really cool idea. It's something that Dash hasn't done yet, but
You know, I don't have a whole lot of detail on anything in particular planned other than survivors who are, you know, in a more secure place have really stepped out. I've heard it at several of the agencies where survivors who have benefited from flexible financial assistance have led their own efforts to share their story, how beneficial it was, and to seek support at maybe it's an event for an organization or in their own communities, whether it's a faith-based organization or just another community where they can really attest to what it meant. And I'm sure there are a lot of other examples out there.
And I can just mention briefly that for us, there's, I guess we sort of think about it in two ways. One, we've had survivors actually hold fundraisers for the coalition to contribute specifically to the survivor fund, so which is really cool. And then the other piece, too, is really also tapping into what the needs are of the survivors, right? So really getting from them, what is it that you wish you had money that you could use for that you can't get from either emergency services, from your county, or from your state, or from the programs that you're working with, and then that's kind of how we built ours.
Great. Thank you, Ho. And I don't want us to forget the state, local, and in particular federal funding that exists. And so I just wanted to flag this for folks to make sure everyone is aware that VOCA assistance can be used for federal funding, and that a final rule related to housing assistance that was clarified in 2016 makes it very clear that VOCA funds can be used for flexible funding. So just some details about what it says in that rule is that it adds transitional housing as an allowable expense, including but not limited to travel, rental assistance, security deposits, utilities, and other costs incidental to the relocation of such housing, as well as voluntary support services such as child care and counseling, which is really exciting. And it also adds relocation expenses as an allowable expense, including costs related to relocating the victim, whenever it's related to the safety and well-being of the victim, and includes but it's not limited to moving expenses, security deposit, rent, and utility startup. So I don't know, Linda, if you want to talk about how VOCA has been used with WSCDIV, but WSCDIV has combined their relocation funds and emergency relocation assistance to offer a deeper level of assistance. Linda, did you want to talk a little bit about how you're doing that with VOCA?
Yeah. And just in particular, when you look at the bullets of what's allowable, there's the whole relocation and the different pieces that are allowable under that, and then there's emergency financial assistance. And oftentimes those emergency buckets work really well combined with relocation funds and braiding that together into a package so that people can get whatever emergency perhaps addressed right away and then delve more into relocation funds that help them with the longer term stability. So that's just an example.
Thank you. So we wanted to share with you some of the exciting things we've learned from evaluating our various flexible funding programs. And what's great is that this research is not only helping us learn more about what we're doing, but has been used by communities all across the country to help them advocate with funders for why flexible funding would be great in their community. So this research is available for you, and we'll share with you how you can access it. But hopefully it's helping to promote the strategy. So just to share a little bit about what we learned when we engaged Dr. Chris Sullivan and Heather Baumsta, researchers from the Consortium on Gender-Based Violence at Michigan State University. They conducted a study on the impact of our flexible funding, which we call our Survivor Resilience Fund. And so survivors were invited to participate when they applied for the grant, and then researchers interviewed them 30 days, 3 months, and 6 months post receiving that grant. These were ultimately 55 survivors agreed to participate in the study. They were primarily African American women with children. And what we learned was that there was a 95% retention rate, 95% of survivors participated up to 3 months, and 87% of survivors participated in the study until the end, 6 months. So just a little bit about over that, what we learned in terms of the amount of support that we provided and what it was generally used for. The average grant that we provided was about $2,000, but it ranged from $275 to $8,500. So very small, as Ho said, a little bit can go a long way, and sometimes it was large. And I just want to flag that just to connect back to the fact that we don't have a cap, but that doesn't mean that every grant is enormous. And in fact, the average was only a couple grand. And they were used for all the things that we talked about, not just moving expenses and utilities, but of course we did use it for that, but we also used flexible funding for car repair, credit card debt, utilities, back rent, storage fees, out-of-state travel. There's some examples of what survivors in our study received grants for. So at the 6-month follow-up, researchers learned that 94% of those who received the flexible funding grant were still housed. 76% were up to date on their rent. 12% said they were somewhat behind on their rent. 6% said there was no way to pay next month's rent. And 6% were homeless at the time of the 6-month follow-up. We also learned that it wasn't just receiving the grant that made the difference, but survivors talked a lot about that process, which we discussed earlier around those core components of an effective flexible funding program. But it really meant a lot for survivors to receive the grant in a low barrier way, so not a lot of documentation or hoops to jump through, that they received it quickly, and that the advocates were caring and non-judgmental. So that makes a big difference, and it connects to survivor well-being and the impact that had on of the grant as well. So midway through the evaluation, our researchers started to ask about survivors' well-being, and they felt that receiving the funds, that they would overall felt that life was better, worse off, or made no difference. And so we asked the question and learned that 100% said that after receiving the SRF grant, that they felt better off. And then researchers asked, would you say that you are more hopeful about the future than you were then, less hopeful, or no change at all? And 90% said that they felt more hopeful. So we learned that the grant also had an impact on safety. We later began asking survivors in 6-month interviews if they had experienced any domestic violence since receiving the flexible funding grant. And of the 23 survivors we asked that question to, 20 or 91% reported no further domestic violence. 1 person reported receiving harassing phone calls, and 2 experienced further domestic violence. So I guess the impact, so this study was really impactful for us because we learned that it wasn't just the grant itself, but the process and how we provided it that was making a difference in survivors' lives. So now we'll pass it over to Linda to share what she's learned through their research on the impact of their work in Washington State.
Thank you. So I've already mentioned the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and their investment, and this was the 5-year pilot and our 13 agencies. I'm not going to go into details about that evaluation. Please go to our webpage and check it out, but it was so promising that it has just become a key service component for DV Housing First. And what we hear from advocates is right there in that quote. It just provides relief for survivors who are trying to rebuild their lives. That original sample size, or the size of the number of people receiving services, the households, 681. And this is just a demographic breakdown, so you can get a picture of how helpful this has been, especially in communities of color. The 3 tribal programs that participated, so over a third of the population were Native American. And we had a number of Latinx households also participating, and then 22% were immigrants and refugees. One of the beauties of the flexible financial assistance, and with this I'm going to answer one of the questions that I can already see, and that is when you are able to give cash versus a check, that it can make it so much more easier for folks who are undocumented, for folks who have other challenges in terms of accounts, just being able to make life easier for them. And of course, right now in these trying times, it could be particularly helpful. We learned that it doesn't take much money to make a difference. Just something like a simple pair of shoes helped her with housing, treatment, and other needs, just because she was able to get places. There wasn't a typical amount. There's the average, $1,250, and the range was $40,000 to $10,000. It allowed agencies to reach a broader group of survivors because it offered a range of options that fit within their community, that helped them within a neighborhood. And it could meet the needs of survivors that weren't necessarily responded to in emergency shelter. It really doesn't take a whole lot of money with advocacy to help someone and change their lives. And this is just one of my favorite nuggets that comes out in advocate focus groups. This particular quote came from a shelter a program director who basically said, it's the happiest money advocates have ever had. It does increase staff morale, and just the beauty I hear time and time again in every agency that we've worked with, being able to say yes has just made it so much easier to help survivors in that step along their journey. Because the pilot worked so well, we got another Gates investment for a demonstration and research project. Dr. Liu Memblini did the initial evaluation on the pilot, and now we have Dr. Chris Sullivan and MSU doing the research component for this additional 5 years. Because we want to track the flexible financial assistance real time, there is a tracker that documents each agency's results. So this is not a longitudinal type of study about just flexible financial assistance. It simply provides some data that we can use ongoing to let us know who's using what. So this particular slide comes from King County, Seattle King County, and that measures 2 years of flexible financial assistance, so you can see the amount that was dispersed. The immediate impact was that 51% of survivors stayed in their home. There were roughly 245 recipients, and there you can see the range of disbursements. I am not sure what that 56-cent one was, but it was important for that survivor, and then all the way up to $5,450. In our primarily rural area, the South Central region, with a lot of Latinx farm workers involved, 408 survivors were served, and they were particularly conscious of how many of them had dependent children in collecting this data. 48% here stayed in their home. Again, a little bit more challenging in terms of home and community with migrant farm workers and dealing with some of the challenges within a community to stay there safely. But a number of them were able to achieve that successfully with flexible financial assistance. And here is the amount that was dispersed. $197,335, ranging from $3.24 through to $3,217. One thing that we try and say when we look at those lower numbers, too many times funders will say, oh my gosh, that's so easy. It's cheap. But, you know, we always are flexible. People can keep coming back if they need more, and they are considered. Here is just a lovely story with the DV Housing First Dollars. We were able to help one survivor stay in her home by paying 2 months of rent, changing the locks on her door. Her car had also broken down, so she couldn't get to work. We helped her fix her car, and she was able to continue to work. So she still has a home and her job because of DV Housing First. Ho, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Linda. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the way we had crafted ours with sort of the limitations that we had. And so we had learned about the flex spending program from Suzanne and Linda a couple years ago, and I was like, this is so awesome. How can we do it? So this was the avenue that we were able to get. So we were able to apply for a All-State Foundation / Purple Purse funding grant. And then we sort of crafted what we called an economic empowerment program. And so one of the biggest goals of this program was, so there's two main goals. And one of the biggest goals is to partner with programs to increase their capacity to work on financial literacy and empowerment. So knowing that financial barriers is also a lot of times barriers for survivors. And so we believe since I work for a coalition and our members are people, believe that being able to build the knowledge and capacity of our advocates will really sort of be key in this whole project. And the second piece of it, too, is that we paired it with what we called a Survivors Fund, which is modeled after the flex funding that Suzanne and Linda had been talking about. So we do have some limitations on it, just again, based on the amount of money that we were able to obtain. And so for us, it was really about a one-time, low-barrier cash grant to victims and survivors for the purposes of, you know, increasing or maintaining housing stability and or credit repair. So the credit repair piece really comes in because we were using the curriculum that the All-State Foundation, Purple Purse / NNADB had created. So again, going back with the low barrier piece, for us, low barrier also means low barrier in the process and also low barrier in the application. So we really kind of put the onus on the advocates in asking them to, you know, one, participate in the economic empowerment program components, go through the curriculum and the training with us at the coalition level, and then working and building relationships one-on-one with the survivor to suss out what their financial need is, and then having the advocates do the application. But the application in itself, we wanted to make sure it didn't ask any questions that was unnecessary. So it really was who you are, how much money do you need, and where does it go? And where does it go? We gave options for, does it need to go to the hand of the survivor? Does it need to go to a vendor? Or does it need to go to a payee? So with the fund disbursement, we were also able to get the money or cut the check within 48 hours, and we're able to send out the check within a week. Or if folks needed to and they had access to us, they could actually just come to our office and pick up the check. And so, again, just quickly on that process, we did all that in-house. So when this program was being built, I had worked with our administrative manager, and she was able to cut checks. So all the applications came through her. We created and facilitated a process that, again, was really built around trust. If you kind of met these really minimal requirements, did you do the training? Are you working with a survivor? And then they turn the application. It goes to our administrative manager. She cuts the check, sends it out. So we were able to do that in-house which we're really fortunate to. But again, that was an organizational commitment on our end to expand our capacity to make that work. So as I said, maybe I didn't mention. So because, again, of the funding limitation, we were only able to do $500 max, and every organization got up to 3 requests. So I know the numbers don't quite add up, but it was sort of that thing where the first came, first served. It's something that we're still kind of struggling with and trying to figure out how to make it as equitable as possible. Yeah. And then the next slide. So again, I call our program small but mighty because every dollar helps and every dollar counts. So just so folks can sort of see what we are working with. So again, we're in our 3rd year now, but I have some information about the first 2 years. In year 1, it was really, again, the funding and the training. We got $50,000 from Allstate, and we also had 2 sub-grantees. So what that means is that we had 2 program partners help me build this entire program. So we gave them some sub-grants to be a part of this. That left us with $20,000 in the actual fund. Year 2, sort of the same deal, except for we ended up getting 3 sub-grantees. We added on a culturally specific program to join our team. And then in that year, we still had $20,000 in the fund, but then we set aside $50,000 specifically for undocumented survivors. So again, knowing that it was super low barrier, we don't ask anything unnecessary except for who you are, where you need the money, or who you are, because we had to write the check out to somebody, what do you need the money for, and how much and where it's going. That same summer, we got a really special treat, the VOCA dollars that Suzanne had mentioned. We were able to get $60,000 as a bonus last summer from VOCA, which we're VOCA VAWA Administrator, which is the Office of Justice Programs. So for this particular summer, we were able to do the same process and the same programming, except for we had $60,000, and we were able to raise the max fund up to $3,000 versus $500. And so that was huge, and that was quick. That money was gone in a month, which we knew it would. And one quick story I want to share about that. So when we were able to give out $3,000, we had an advocate share with me that the person that she had requested that money for was able to buy a house. So she was able, so they lived up in, so I don't know if people are familiar with the state of Minnesota, but in Minnesota, the very northern end, there's the chimney. So that person was able to buy a manufactured home and new appliances. And so she was able to buy a house and furnish it, which is pretty amazing. And then the next piece is, again, so talking about like a little goes a long way. For the $20,000, we were able to, there were 46 survivors that we were able to give grants to, which is pretty amazing. And so our average grant was around $400-something, and then a majority of people requested the $500. So as you can see, the breakdown of how people used the funds, some of that was pretty traditional, secure deposit, rent, others were miscellaneous debt, car-related expenses, etc. And here we just did a little quick survey, again, kind of modeling off of what DASH did. Ours wasn't as extensive because we didn't have researchers. It was just sort of me trying to figure out how to do this. But we also were curious about sort of this little impact, right? Like, what did it actually do to help, if any, facilitate any change in a survivor's life? So one of the questions we asked is the situation at the time, had it been resolved? And the majority of people said it was resolved, and then we have some folks here, you can see 13 and 17% say it was sort of resolved or no. And then another question is, did you feel more stable after the money? And so for some people, they said, yeah, for sure, you know, they got their own transportation, security system, and for some folks, no, which is, you know, we, again, knowing that $500 wasn't necessarily going to be the game changer, but for some people it was. And so, yeah, so we're on our 3rd year continuing with this. And like I had mentioned earlier in the presentation, we're getting a lot more individual donors, and so we had a survivor actually throw a fundraiser specifically for this fund and raise, I think it was $4,000 that she just raised. She threw a party and was like, contribute to the survivor fund, and told them all about this work, and other people came and joined. And then we had another staff member at the coalition throw a birthday party fundraiser, and was able to get like $1,000 or $2,000 that way. So for us, because we're giving pretty low grants of $500, that money goes a long way for us. So yeah, that's all.
Great. Well, I saw there's a question specifically about how you all administer the Allstate grant. So I'll just read it and then you can respond. So somebody, Naseem, asked about the Allstate grant. She says that the Allstate grant asks coalitions to only use 15% of the grant and distribute the rest among 2 to 3 programs. How did you work around this requirement?
Sure. So like I said, not necessarily doing the math here, but we gave more money to our program partners than we did for the fund. So $50,000 was the full grant that we got from Allstate, and then only $20,000 of that went towards the fund.
Thank you. Well, why don't we move over to questions, because we got some great questions throughout the presentation. And we'll start at the beginning. Danielle, you asked, do you have to file any tax forms if you pay a certain amount towards rental assistance? Good question. I don't know.
This is Linda. No, the agency doesn't have to file tax forms if you're paying a certain amount towards rental assistance. You of course have your $9.90, but that's not a tax form. That's just your status as operating as a charitable organization. You're good. Don't worry about it.
Great.
I also see that you had a question about an outside fiscal company, and no, the funds are handled within each of the organizations.
Yeah, and that's true for Dash 2. And it would be ideal, I imagine, especially when we talk about trying to get those funds turned around rapidly, that it's better if it's in-house, if possible. So Shivas asked, she says, I'm coming across issues with landlords not accepting third-party payment for client rental payments. What are some ideas you have to lower this barrier for clients? So, yeah.
That would be my quick Linda answer. Suzanne, okay. Do you have more?
No, you do your quick Linda answer.
Oh, well, that would be cash to the client.
Cash.
We're very familiar with a lot of landlords that don't want to do a W-9. They don't want third-party checks, so we encourage folks to just do cash for the survivor.
Yeah, us too. And and it's not just the landlord. Sometimes the survivor doesn't want her status as a survivor disclosed. So it's a great way to get us out of the mix. And something we didn't mention, but we talk about it in our FAQ, which we'll share with you all, is just this notion that advocates doing flex funding have to push up against a lot, which is, you give cash to survivors, like that seems risky, and there's a lot of assumptions and prejudices about programs giving cash directly to clients and thinking that they'll misuse those funds. But it's just deeply held prejudices about them, about survivors not being the best people to make decisions on their own behalf. And we have research and experience that says otherwise. And it's something that we've also been learning through international philanthropic work, is that they've been doing this in international aid, just giving cash directly to people in need and finding that that too goes a long way, and that survivors typically and people in need who need the cash spend it exactly in ways that help them maintain their stability. So anyways, yeah, direct cash assistance. And then I'm sorry, go ahead, Ho.
Oh, no, I was just going to jump and say, like, so that was also one of the things that we had to get buy-in from our membership around, was sort of, you know, the idea of us writing out a check to the survivor. And one of the things that we kind of came to grip with as our team was saying, so let's say that the survivor requested this money and they spend it for something else, right? Let's say that that happens. So the first question is, one, what is the worst of that? And two, is there a reason why the survivor maybe felt like they couldn't be honest with you, the advocate, or the program as to what they actually need the money for? So that was also something that we came to consider too.
And I would just agree with that, Ho, because sometimes that does happen. You know, none of us are perfect, and sometimes what the survivor really needed might not have been our logical choice, and they did what they needed to do for themselves. And it's not necessarily something that we should necessarily judge. But, yeah.
Hear, hear. So Teray, sorry.
Go ahead. I was just going to read it, but you do it.
Oh, go ahead, Linda. No, go ahead.
It's about requiring survivors to provide receipts when they receive cash from your program. For auditing purposes, the agencies do ask for a receipt directly from the survivor when they receive cash. We really discourage the idea that a survivor should be coming back with a receipt on what it was they purchased. I know there are some entities out there that encourage that, would like to see that happen, but that is just, I don't know. There's something about the trust relationship of feeling like a survivor has to prove what it was they spent the money for. But
for us in Minnesota, there was no receipts. So for us, there was no receipts. We write you the check, or we do the vendor, and you do what you need to do.
Yeah, and because our public funder required receipts, that's when we teased out whether or not, so because we had that public-private partnership, you know, if it was easy for a survivor to get receipts and it was something that we could do, you know, we would charge that to the public funds, and then in ways where it was more challenging, we would just use private money. So again, it's always great when you can have those options, so you don't have to require receipts as a matter of course.
And just be sure to check in with your auditor. I know when we do our focus groups, and we will reimburse somebody for their wages for a day if they had to miss that, or we try and do other incentive cash payments. All we do is just, again, indicate that money was provided and somebody initials that it was, and that satisfies our auditor when we're in a place to do that.
And then I'll also just say it also depends on your funding source. And so for us, so the Allstate money is a bit more flexible, plus getting donations is very flexible, that when we got the VOCA dollars, that even though we try to keep the process the same as possible, we also have to be mindful that with VOCA dollars, I don't believe that you can do money to either to vendors or directly to survivors. I can't remember which it is. So Suzanne and Linda, if you correct me if I'm wrong, so we had to change that. So we weren't able to sort of be as radical and as open as we wanted to when it came to that, but we were still able to sort of use the same prereqs and all that.
Yeah, and again, I think that's just the beauty if you have the luxury of more than one funding stream with different kinds of requirements, then you can go back and forth. But I know that that's not always possible. But ideally, if you can have different pots of money to provide, you know, the same kind of flexibility we want to be able to offer. I mean, it's so much connected to the funding stream.
Right.
I do want to catch this question because Angelita asks if we have application forms and other tools anything from research on tracking disbursements. And Linda, you all have a fabulous form, right, that's available for
Right.
programs to use, because I know we've borrowed it.
Mm-hmm. Right,
Um,
and it's
yeah.
on our webpage, I do believe,
Yep.
the
And we'll
Flexible Financial Assistance Tracker.
Yeah, that's a great form to use, and I'm really thankful that they offered that. And then, so that's, and we'll be, Jenny's going to send all the participants a follow-up email with all of those links, but that's one form. And then on the FAQ that we're providing, you'll see there's some links to some other more details about our processes. And forms are a funny thing because they're a great way to share with folks some of the program elements that we use, and at the same time I know Dash has shied away from forms because then they're so easy to slip into like the check the box routine, and that's not what we want to do with survivors when we're working with them, but to have that conversation. So one of the things on our FAQ is a link to just the process of how we, connect with a survivor, the kinds of questions we ask, how our advocates come to those determinations around funding. It's not a form, but it sort of details the process that we use. Okay, and I see the last question is from Danielle. She says, for my organization, we have an outside fiscal company that handles the checks. We have the checks sent back to me, and I send them to the companies on behalf of the survivor. We are not allowed to put funds towards rental assistance or mortgages that go over $575. Is there a way that we can go around this? It is because we have to fill out a tax form. Any thoughts?
Yeah, Danielle, I'm just really surprised, and my first thought when I saw this is I am so sorry. I'm just wondering about the source of the money, and of course also your organization in terms of the fiscal company that handles the checks. What you're describing is something that I haven't heard of before. I know certainly that 575 kind of bumps up to the 600 I was talking about that is often used as that top number for somebody's 1099, but it's not necessary. So I guess I would have to have more information in order to give a better informed response. Because I'm not quite sure I understand why you've got so many hoops you have to jump through.
And I'll just add, Jenny is going to send out evaluation to this webinar, and on that is a link to request technical assistance. So we can get back to you and talk in more details about your program. I do want to flag a really good tip that Gabriella posted in the chat that they use a company credit card for flex funding. And I know a lot of folks are doing that. Dash has not, but I know that that's something that programs use to make it easier and to streamline things. So thank you for sharing that tip.
A lot of our agencies give advocates credit cards that are for that particular flexible financial assistance account, and they are able to purchase things for the survivor. It's smooth, it's streamlined. They generally have one person who tracks the money so that there's always enough money in that card, so that 3 or 4 different people don't spend it out without that communication. But it seems to work really well.
Great. Well, I think that we actually managed to hit all the questions and stay within our time. So if I don't see any other questions, I would just reiterate that we provide technical assistance through, here's some contact information. and how you can reach us and request TA either to Linda or Ho directly, or you can email Nash and request technical assistance. And like I mentioned before, Jenny's going to send all of the participants information, specific information that we talked about, the FAQ, and a link to the Washington State Coalition's toolkit that has some fabulous tools. And again, please just don't hesitate to reach out as your work unfolds, as you put your program together. Any questions you have, as you can tell, Linda, Ho, and I are huge evangelists when it comes to flex funding. We've seen how impactful it is, and such a small amount goes such a long way, or can. So we wish you the best of luck in your work. And I don't know, Ho and Linda, if there's anything else you want to add, but again, just don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have questions or would like more information.
All I would add is have fun. It's a great opportunity to feel good about the work you do with survivors, or even better about the work you do with survivors.
Mm-hmm. And I was just going to say, Naseem, that question you had around the funding, if you are more curious about our particular program, you can go ahead and send me an email, and then I can follow up with you about that. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways to do this. So I think that's also the really cool thing, is that, again, learning from Linda and Suzanne and sort of how they do it, we were really able to sort of think of how do we sort of keep this core principle and create a program that really kind of works for within our limitations.
Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And as Jenny mentioned in the chat box, we will be in touch. Look out for an email from us about all the resources that we mentioned. And please don't hesitate to reach out to us as your work unfolds. So thank you, everybody. And we look forward to hearing from you. Best of luck.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.